The American Revolution 1776, the fall of New York. In the early morning of August 22nd, 1776, thousands of British soldiers crossed the waters separating Staten Island from Long Island. Packed into dozens of flat-bottomed landing boats, nearly 4,000 troops came ashore at Gravesend Bay, where they were greeted not with resistance, but with celebration. Loyalist families rushed to welcome the King's army. They supplied food, fresh horses, and valuable intelligence about the surrounding countryside. More importantly, they confirmed what General William Howe already suspected. Many people in New York still believed the rebellion could be crushed. Within days, the landing force expanded to nearly 20,000 men. After weeks of waiting for reinforcements from Britain, Ireland, the German states, and across the Atlantic Empire, Howe finally commanded the largest expeditionary army Britain had ever assembled outside Europe. Its objective was simple: destroy George Washington's army, end the rebellion before it could become a true war. The first obstacle stood across the ridges overlooking Brooklyn. If these defensive positions fell, Long Island would belong to Britain. New York City would become impossible to defend, and the American Revolution might end before reaching its second year. Across the East River, General George Washington commanded roughly 20,000 Continental soldiers. On paper, the numbers looked promising. Reality was very different. Only a handful of regiments, such as the Delaware Blues and the 1st Maryland Regiment, were properly trained and disciplined. Most of the army consisted of inexperienced volunteers who lacked both equipment and military experience. Disease spread relentlessly through camp. Typhus and dysentery weakened thousands. Desertion continued almost daily. Nearly 1/4 of Washington's army was either too sick to fight or simply absent. Even worse, Washington himself faced an impossible dilemma. He believed the British landing on Long Island might only be a diversion. If he committed his entire army there, Howe might strike Manhattan instead. As a result, Washington kept more than half of his forces north of the East River to protect New York City and the Hudson. The decision would prove disastrous. Around 6,000 Continental soldiers, commanded by General Israel Putnam, occupied fortifications around Brooklyn. Farther forward, another 3,000 men under Generals John Sullivan and William Alexander, Lord Stirling, defended the wooded hills leading toward the city. Their lines stretched nearly for miles. They were responsible for guarding the 3 major roads crossing the Guan Heights. It was simply too much ground for the few men. At dawn on August 27th, British forces advanced. Roughly 5,000 redcoats launched a direct assault against the American front. Musket fire echoed through the forests. Cannons thundered across the hills. For the first time during the war, the Continental Army fought the British in a large open field engagement. To many observers' surprise, the Americans held their ground remarkably well. But the attack unfolding before them was only half of Howe's plan. As Sullivan shifted troops to reinforce Lord Stirling's position, distant gunfire suddenly erupted behind the American lines. Within moments, the horrifying truth became clear: the British had found another route. Using a little-known fourth pass through the hills, General Howe secretly marched nearly 10,000 soldiers around the American flank. The Continental line had been completely outmaneuvered. At the same moment, 5,000 Hessian infantry charged directly into the weakened center. The Hessians possessed a fearsome reputation throughout Europe. Many American militiamen had never faced professional soldiers before. Panic spread almost instantly. Units dissolved. Men abandoned their positions. The organized defense collapsed into a desperate race toward Brooklyn. Only a few elite regiments maintained discipline. The 1st Maryland Regiment and the Delaware Battalion stood their ground, covering the retreat while the rest of the army escaped. Outnumbered nearly 10-1, the Marylanders launched repeated counterattacks against overwhelming British forces. Their sacrifice bought precious time. It also destroyed the regiment. Watching from the Brooklyn defenses, Washington could only stare in horror. According to witnesses, he cried, "Good God! What brave fellows I must this day lose!" The Battle of Long Island had become the greatest defeat of Washington's military career. Escape from Long Island. The defeat on Long Island was devastating. British losses totaled fewer than 400 casualties, while the Continental Army suffered well over 2,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Among the prisoners were Generals John Sullivan and Lord Stirling, two of Washington's most capable commanders. The survivors fell back into the defensive works around Brooklyn. Now they faced an even greater danger. Behind them flowed the East River. Ahead stood nearly the entire British Army. For many officers on both sides, it appeared the Revolution had reached its final chapter. General Howe held every advantage. His troops outnumbered the Americans, his navy controlled the surrounding waters, and Washington's army seemed trapped with nowhere to escape. Many British officers urged an immediate assault. Had Howe attacked at once, the Continental Army might have been destroyed in a single day. Instead, remembering the heavy casualties suffered at Bunker Hill, he chose caution. Confident that Washington had no escape, Howe ordered his engineers to dig siege lines and slowly tighten the noose around Brooklyn. It was a decision that would change history. The following day, torrential rain drenched both armies. Washington understood that every passing hour increased the danger. The only reason British warships had not sailed into the East River and sealed his escape was a steady northeasterly wind that prevented them from advancing. If the wind shifted, the Continental Army would be trapped forever. There was no time to lose. Washington ordered one of the most remarkable withdrawals in military history. During the night of August 29th, every available boat was gathered along the Brooklyn shoreline. Under complete silence, soldiers, horses, cannons, and supplies were ferried across the East River toward Manhattan. Experienced sailors from Massachusetts guided the overloaded boats through darkness without lights, while officers quietly moved regiment after regiment toward the waiting shoreline. Not a single drum sounded. No campfires betrayed their movement. Even the wounded endured the crossing without complaint. Then nature offered one final miracle. As dawn approached, a dense blanket of fog settled over Brooklyn. The mist concealed the final American units as they crossed the river only hours before British patrols advanced toward the abandoned defenses. When Howe's soldiers finally occupied the American positions, they found them empty. Washington and his entire army had disappeared. An American lieutenant later reflected that he could recall no retreat in military history that had been carried out with greater fortune or discipline. The Revolution had survived by the narrowest of margins. Although Washington had escaped destruction, the campaign was far from over. 2 weeks later, in September 1776, General Howe paused his military advance for an entirely different reason. Despite the recent victory, he still hoped the conflict could end through negotiation rather than endless bloodshed. Both Howe and his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, had been appointed Royal Peace Commissioners by King George III, alongside commanding Britain's military forces. They possessed authority to offer pardons and restore peace to the colonies provided the Americans abandoned their rebellion. A meeting was arranged with representatives of the Continental Congress. Among them were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge. The discussions were courteous, but they achieved nothing. The American delegates made one thing unmistakably clear. Too much blood had already been spilled. Too many towns had been occupied or burned. The colonies would never again accept British rule on the same terms as before. The opportunity for reconciliation had passed. From this point forward, the conflict would be decided not by diplomacy, but by armies in the field. Meanwhile, fear spread throughout New York City. Nearly half of the civilian population fled before the advancing British Army. Those who remained were largely loyalists who welcomed the return of royal authority. Washington faced another painful decision. British warships now dominated both the Hudson River and the East River. Holding New York had become impossible. On September 12th, the Continental Army began abandoning the city. The evacuation continued for several days as wagons, artillery, and exhausted soldiers streamed northward. Before the withdrawal could be completed, however, House struck again. On September 15th, nearly 4,000 British and German troops landed at Kipps Bay, supported by the devastating firepower of around 80 naval guns. The bombardment shattered American morale almost immediately. Many inexperienced militia units broke and fled without firing a shot. Entire formations dissolved into panicked crowds racing away from the shoreline. Watching the collapse unfold before him, Washington rode directly toward the fleeing soldiers, desperately trying to rally them. No one stopped. No one turned back. For one of the few times in his military career, Washington completely lost his temper. "Are these the men," he shouted in frustration, "with whom I am to defend America?" His words reflected the painful reality. The Continental Army was exhausted, poorly trained, and dangerously close to falling apart. Yet, despite every setback, Washington refused to surrender. The struggle for American independence was entering its darkest chapter, and its outcome remained uncertain. New York falls. On September 15, 1776, General William Howe entered New York City in triumph. For Loyalists, it was a moment of celebration. After months of uncertainty, the King's Army had reclaimed Britain's most important colonial port almost without a fight. One British officer mocked the American withdrawal, remarking that a city the rebels had spent months fortifying had been abandoned within hours, with scarcely any serious resistance. Yet Washington was determined that his army would not suffer another humiliating collapse. The very next day, an opportunity arrived. As British forces pushed north from Manhattan, they encountered Continental troops positioned along the wooded ridges of Harlem Heights. Unlike the panic at Kipps Bay, these soldiers stood their ground. American riflemen harassed the advancing British light infantry before Washington committed additional reinforcements to the fight. The engagement quickly developed into a series of fierce skirmishes across rocky fields and dense woodland. This time, it was the British who were forced to pull back. Although small by European standards, the victory carried enormous psychological weight. For the first time since Long Island, the Continental Army had met British regulars in open combat and driven them back. The success restored a measure of confidence to soldiers who desperately needed proof that Britain's veterans were not invincible. But while armies fought beyond the city, tragedy struck within New York itself. On the hot, dry night of September 20th, 1776, flames suddenly erupted among the tightly packed wooden buildings of Lower Manhattan. Driven by strong winds, the fire spread with terrifying speed. Entire streets disappeared behind walls of smoke. Families fled carrying whatever possessions they could save. Church bells rang continuously as soldiers and civilians struggled to stop the inferno. Witnesses described scenes of utter chaos. The sick and elderly stumbled through smoke-filled streets. Women clutched terrified children while burning rooftops collapsed around them. Exploding timbers and falling buildings filled the night with deafening noise. By the time the fire was finally brought under control, nearly 1/4 of New York City had been destroyed. No one could determine with certainty how the blaze had begun. Some blamed accidental negligence. Others accused Patriot saboteurs of deliberately setting the city alight before abandoning it. Whatever its origin, the destruction created immense hardship for the thousands of civilians forced to endure the approaching winter. October brought a new British offensive. Determined to outmaneuver Washington once again, Howe loaded nearly 12,000 soldiers onto transports and sailed north through the East River. Rather than attacking the Continental Army head-on, he intended to land behind Washington's flank and cut off his retreat. British troops came ashore at Pell's Point. American forces fought a stubborn, delaying action, buying valuable time as Washington withdrew toward White Plains. The strategy succeeded. Although forced to retreat, the Continental Army escaped encirclement once again. 10 days later, Howe attacked. The battle centered around Chatterton Hill, where Hessian regiments advanced with disciplined determination against American defenses. Continental artillery and musket fire tore into the attacking columns. For a time, the defenders held firm, but superior British numbers gradually overwhelmed the position. The Delaware troops once again covered Washington's retreat, allowing the main army to withdraw before disaster struck. Both sides suffered roughly 200 casualties, but strategically the result favored Britain. Washington had been driven back yet again. The constant defeats began to erode confidence throughout the colonies. Desertion increased with alarming speed. Thousands of enlistments were nearing their end, while new volunteers became increasingly difficult to recruit. Even inside the Continental Army, doubts about Washington's leadership began to spread. His second-in-command, General Charles Lee, openly questioned the commander's judgment. Writing privately, Lee criticized what he believed was Washington's fatal inability to make decisive military decisions. In his view, hesitation was a greater weakness than ignorance or even lack of personal courage. Many officers quietly wondered whether someone else should lead the revolution. Washington soon faced another impossible decision. 15 miles south of White Plains stood Fort Washington, a powerful fortress overlooking the Hudson River. The fort had been built to prevent British warships from sailing upriver. In reality, it had failed to stop them. Many senior officers recommended abandoning the isolated position before it was surrounded. Washington hesitated. Rather than issuing a direct order, he left the final decision to General Nathanael Greene, who believed the fort could still be defended. It proved to be a costly mistake. On the morning of November 16th, General Howe launched a massive assault. Nearly 8,000 British and Hessian troops attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The defenders fought stubbornly throughout the morning, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. By midday, resistance collapsed. More than 2,800 American soldiers had been killed or captured. It was one of the greatest single losses suffered by the Continental Army during the entire Revolutionary War. The New York campaign had become a stunning British success. For Washington, the consequences were devastating. His army had been driven from New York. His soldiers were exhausted. Morale had reached its lowest point. And now, with winter approaching, the British prepared to carry the war across the Hudson River into New Jersey. The darkest days of the American Revolution still lay ahead. America's darkest winter, the fall of Fort Washington marked the collapse of the American defense of New York. For General William Howe, the campaign had been an overwhelming success. New York was securely in British hands. The Continental Army had suffered repeated defeats, and the road into New Jersey now lay open. Washington had no choice but to retreat. With British forces crossing the Hudson River in strength, the Continental Army began a desperate march westward across New Jersey. Behind them came an enemy determined to finish the war before winter. The pursuit had begun. Washington now commanded fewer than 6,000 exhausted soldiers. Many lacked proper shoes. Others wrapped rags around bleeding feet as they struggled through rain, mud, and the bitter cold. The commander hoped fresh volunteers would join him as he marched through New Jersey. Instead, he encountered fear and uncertainty. Months of British victories had shattered public confidence in the revolution. Many civilians doubted that the Continental Army could survive another campaign. One contemporary wrote that a heavy cloud of darkness seemed to hang over the land, while despair could be seen on nearly every face. The optimism that had followed the Declaration of Independence only months earlier had almost completely vanished. On November 30th, 1776, General Howe issued a proclamation that further weakened the Patriot cause. Any rebel willing to swear a new oath of loyalty to the British Crown would receive a full pardon. The offer appealed to thousands of weary colonists who wanted nothing more than peace. Across New Jersey and New York, increasing numbers accepted British protection. Among them were prominent political leaders, including Richard Stockton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. For many families caught between two armies, survival mattered more than ideology. The revolution appeared to be collapsing from within. Washington's situation grew even worse. On December 1st, the enlistments of nearly half his army expired. After months of constant retreat, around 2,000 soldiers simply gathered their belongings and returned home. Their legal obligation had ended. They had done their duty. Now they wanted nothing more to do with the war. Every departure left Washington with fewer men to oppose one of the most powerful armies in the world. Winter arrived early. Snow began covering the roads as the Continental Army continued its retreat toward the Delaware River. Every boat that could not be carried across was destroyed, denying the British an easy crossing. It was a calculated move, but one born of desperation. Farther south, panic spread through Philadelphia. As rumors of the advancing British Army reached the city, members of the Continental Congress hurried to protect government records and prepare for evacuation. Many feared the capital would soon fall. Congressman Robert Morris later reflected on the dramatic change in public spirit. When the war had begun, almost every man had spoken boldly of liberty and resistance. Now, with death, hardship, and defeat becoming daily realities, many who had once shouted the loudest for independence sought only safety and forgiveness. The revolution stood on the edge of disaster. Convinced that victory was only a matter of time, General Howe returned to New York for the winter. He left around 14,000 British and Hessian troops scattered across New Jersey in a chain of isolated garrisons. Their mission was simple: maintain order, encourage more colonists to accept royal pardons, wait for the final collapse of Washington's army. Meanwhile, another British success followed. General Henry Clinton sailed to Newport, Rhode Island, capturing the important port without losing a single soldier. The king's forces now controlled much of the northeastern coastline. From London's perspective, the rebellion was all but over. Then came another devastating blow for the Americans. General Charles Lee, Washington's controversial second-in-command, had separated himself from the main army and was staying at a tavern several miles behind his troops. There, British cavalry launched a surprise raid. Lee was captured without a major fight. His sudden loss threw the Continental Command into confusion. Many of the soldiers under his command deserted immediately, believing the cause was hopeless. The remainder, led by General John Sullivan, marched to join Washington along the Delaware River. Even with these reinforcements, the Continental Army could barely assemble 6,000 men. Worse still, the enlistments of most of those soldiers would expire within only a few weeks. If nothing changed before the end of the year, Washington would soon have almost no army left to command. The American Revolution had reached its lowest point. Yet, in the face of overwhelming odds, Washington refused to surrender. Instead of waiting for defeat, he began planning one of the boldest military operations in American history: the crossing of the Delaware. By the final weeks of December 1776, the American Revolution stood on the brink of collapse. The Continental Army numbered barely 6,000 men, and even that fragile force was temporary. Within days, the enlistments of most soldiers would expire. Unless something extraordinary happened, Washington's army would simply disappear. The commander understood the grim reality. A defensive strategy would lead only to slow defeat. If the revolution was to survive, he would have to seize the initiative and gamble everything on a single, daring strike. Washington devised a plan that was as ambitious as it was dangerous. Under the cover of darkness on Christmas night, 3 separate American columns would cross the frozen Delaware River at different locations. The 2 smaller forces, led by General James Ewing and Colonel John Cadwalader, would launch diversionary attacks against British positions near Assunpink Creek and Bordentown, drawing enemy attention away from the main objective. Meanwhile, Washington himself would lead approximately 2,400 soldiers across the river several miles upstream. After landing, the army would divide into two columns, march through the night, and converge on the Hessian garrison at Trenton just before dawn. If everything unfolded according to schedule, the enemy would be surrounded before they even realized they were under attack. It was an audacious plan, but success depended on perfect timing and favorable weather. Washington would receive neither. As darkness settled on December 25th, the crossing began. The Delaware was a formidable obstacle. Nearly 300 yards wide, its swift current carried massive sheets of drifting ice downstream. Freezing rain mixed with snow, while bitter winds swept across the river, transporting thousands of men, artillery pieces, horses, and supplies through such conditions seemed almost impossible. Yet experienced boatmen from the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania militias worked tirelessly throughout the night, guiding overloaded Durham boats back and forth across the icy water. The operation demanded extraordinary discipline. Despite the darkness and violent weather, not a single cannon was lost, not one boat capsized. By itself, the crossing was already one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the Revolutionary War, but serious problems soon emerged. The relentless storm slowed every movement. Washington's force reached the New Jersey shore nearly 3 hours behind schedule. Even worse, the worsening ice prevented both Ewing and Cadwalader from completing their own crossings. The carefully coordinated three-pronged attack had effectively collapsed before the battle had even begun. Many commanders would have abandoned the mission. Washington made the opposite decision. The blizzard, he reasoned, was now his greatest ally. No enemy commander would expect an army to attack through such impossible weather. The operation would continue. Leaving the river behind, the Continental Army split into two marching columns exactly as planned. The soldiers struggled through snow, freezing rain, and deep mud. Many had no boots. Blood stained the frozen ground where bare feet pressed against ice-covered roads. Yet no one abandoned the march. No one complained. Each man understood what was at stake. If they failed, the revolution itself might not survive the winter. The town of Trenton was defended by roughly 1,400 Hessian soldiers under the command of Colonel Johann Rall. Experienced and highly disciplined, the Hessians had earned a formidable reputation across Europe. Rall had received warnings that an American attack was possible. However, after driving away a small Patriot militia force on Christmas Day, he concluded that Washington lacked both the strength and the courage to launch a major offensive. The terrible weather only reinforced his confidence. Surely no army would choose such a night to fight. As Christmas celebrations continued inside Trenton, security became increasingly relaxed. The perfect opportunity had arrived. Shortly after dawn on December 26th, Washington struck. General Nathanael Greene's column swept in from the north, overwhelming the Hessian outposts and driving them back into the streets of Trenton. As confused defenders attempted to form ranks, Colonel Henry Knox rapidly deployed American artillery at key intersections. His cannons blasted the narrow streets with devastating effect, preventing the Hessians from organizing an effective defense. Moments later, General John Sullivan's division entered the town from another direction, seizing the bridge over a sunbanked creek and cutting off the enemy's escape. Colonel Rall desperately attempted to rally his men for a counterattack. Before he could regain control, he was struck by enemy fire and mortally wounded. Within less than an hour, organized resistance collapsed. The Battle of Trenton was over. The Hessians suffered around 100 killed and wounded, while nearly 900 soldiers were captured. American casualties were astonishingly light. Only a handful of men had been wounded. Against all expectations, Washington had achieved one of the most dramatic victories of the Revolutionary War. As the captured Hessians marched through the streets toward Philadelphia, celebrations erupted across the colonies. For the first time in months, hope returned to the Patriot cause. The revolution had not only survived, it had been reborn. The victory at Princeton, the triumph at Trenton electrified the American colonies, but Washington knew the campaign was far from over. The British command reacted immediately. When news of the Hessian defeat reached New York, General William Howe ordered Lord Charles Cornwallis to march at once with approximately 80 veteran soldiers to destroy Washington's army before it could escape. For the Continental Army, the danger was greater than ever. Their victory had restored hope, but it had not solved their greatest problems. The men were exhausted, supplies remained scarce, and once again, many enlistments were only days away from expiring. If the army dispersed now, everything they had achieved at Trenton would be lost. Washington gathered his officers and appealed directly to the men. He reminded them of everything they had endured together: months of retreat, hunger, freezing marches, and repeated defeats. Now, he told them, their country needed them one final time. The struggle for liberty was not yet won. Their families, their homes, and the future of the revolution depended upon what they chose to do next. If they agreed to remain in service for just one more month, they could deliver a blow that history would never forget. His words struck a powerful chord. Supported by a bounty equal to 2 months' pay, the overwhelming majority of the soldiers agreed to stay. The Continental Army had been granted one last opportunity. Washington intended to use it, leaving a force of roughly 1,200 men to secure Princeton. Cornwallis advanced rapidly toward Trenton. The march, however, proved slower than expected. American riflemen harassed the British columns at every opportunity, forcing them to deploy repeatedly into battle formation. At the same time, an unexpected thaw transformed frozen roads into thick mud, delaying artillery and supply wagons. Every hour worked in Washington's favor. By the time Cornwallis reached Trenton, the Continental Army had already established defensive positions behind a sunken creek. The narrow bridge across the creek offered the British only one practical route of attack. Late in the afternoon, Cornwallis launched a series of probing assaults. Again and again, disciplined volleys from the American defenders drove the attackers back. The creek became a deadly barrier. British casualties mounted while Washington's line held firm. As darkness fell, Cornwallis decided against another costly assault. Confident that the Americans were trapped, he postponed the final attack until sunrise. Many British officers believed victory was now only hours away. They had no idea that Washington had already devised another escape. As night settled over the battlefield, the American camp remained unusually active. Campfires continued burning. Small groups of soldiers maintained their positions, creating the impression that the entire army remained behind its earthworks. In reality, Washington was preparing one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the Revolutionary War. Under complete silence, the main body of the Continental Army slipped away from Trenton. Rather than retreating toward Pennsylvania, they marched north through rough back roads toward Princeton, carefully avoiding the British Army only a few miles away. The winter night concealed their movement. By dawn, Washington's soldiers had marched around Cornwallis's left flank and were approaching Princeton from the south. Instead of escaping, they were preparing to strike again. At first light on January 3, 1777, British troops stationed at Princeton began marching south to reinforce Cornwallis. Before they had gone far, they encountered the advancing Continental Army. Both sides hurried to form battle lines. Musket fire echoed across the frozen fields. Initially, the experienced British infantry gained the advantage. American units began falling back under intense pressure. For a moment, another defeat seemed inevitable. Then Washington rode directly toward the front. Ignoring the bullets flying around him, he placed himself between the retreating Americans and the advancing British line. His calm determination inspired the soldiers around him. Officers later recalled the extraordinary sight of their commander riding through clouds of smoke with enemy fire sweeping across the battlefield. His presence steadied the wavering line. The Continental troops rallied. With renewed determination, they surged forward. Unable to withstand the growing pressure, the British line finally broke. The surviving soldiers retreated in disorder toward New Brunswick, abandoning the field. The Battle of Princeton was won. British losses totaled roughly 400 killed, wounded, or captured. American casualties numbered fewer than 100 men. Although small compared to the great battles fought in Europe, Princeton carried enormous strategic significance. In little more than a week, Washington had transformed the entire course of the campaign. The victories at Trenton and Princeton shattered the illusion of British invincibility, revived Patriot morale, and forced British commanders to abandon much of their network of isolated outposts across New Jersey. For the first time since the disastrous retreat from New York, the initiative had shifted. The Continental Army had not only survived, it had proven that it could outfight and outthink the most powerful military empire in the world. Yet Washington understood that his exhausted army could push no farther. Low on food, ammunition, and winter clothing, the soldiers desperately needed rest. Instead of risking another engagement, he led the army to the hills around Morristown, where they would establish winter quarters and prepare for the campaigns that still lay ahead. The Revolution had endured its darkest winter. Now, for the first time in many months, victory no longer seemed impossible.